Today, I thought I would share my thoughts on an allegory from the Twilight Zone, Season 1, Episode 15, called I Shot an Arrow into the Air. This specific episode has always stuck out with me, and I've been wanting to do something on it for a few years now. I recently took some notes, and I thought I would just kind of throw together a small short form video for people that follow this channel, because I know that everybody doesn't actually read very much anymore, which is unfortunate, and they are very much used to digesting video content, which is not necessarily a bad thing to digest video content, but I highly would recommend reading as much as possible. This allegory specifically deals with the triune aspect of consciousness and our brain biology and anatomy. So for those who don't understand, the first thing I would say is a basic understanding of the structure of the human brain is necessary if one truly wishes to understand both the basic dynamic of consciousness and the situation in which humanity currently finds itself. The brain is generally recognized as the seat of consciousness in the body. While I would never claim that consciousness is limited to the brain is certainly the organ through which we most directly connect to consciousness on a physical level. Fundamentally, consciousness has two aspects, which is extremely important to distinguish one from the other. One is the result of comparison, the other of identification. Both aspects need to be inscribed. One is an organic or cerebral inscription. The other is a vital or functional inscription. So what this means is that the vital aspects of consciousness is the fundamental field of reality, being the pool in which all the organs, being our brains, channel this essential consciousness or vital consciousness into. The other is the monad consciousness, which is expressed through the cerebral activity. So just look at the brain as a radio that is tuning into the specific frequency of collective consciousness, and we are pulling from an ocean of consciousness at the fundamental aspect of reality. Another way we could define consciousness is the ability to pattern recognize. So our consciousness has three expressions, and this threefold nature is thought, emotion, and action. And just as consciousness itself has this three-in-one nature, so in fact does the human brain. So this idea of the threefold brain was proposed in the modern era by an American neuroscientist, Paul MacLean, who correlated human behavioral manifestations with the psychological structures inherent in the brain. His research led to the formulation of a concept known as the triune brain. What I would like to make clear here is that this is not something newly discovered. It has been very much been aware of, especially to the ancient Egyptians, because they studied anatomy so deeply. So this triune aspect of the brain is not a newly discovered thing. It has been known and intuited, but also intellectually broke down by the ancients. So as we progress in this little allegorical breakdown, I will be explaining these three areas of the brain and their correlation to their behaviors. And this episode is a great way of not only showing the dangers of an out of balance brain and consciousness, but also a good deductive process to understand how these three functions of the brain work. So in this episode, it is a very simple plot that reveals a deep, profound, esoteric allegory about the brain complexes, the human experience, the way we respond to trauma, and specifically how the brain functions for people who have elevated themselves into higher reasoning and disciplined their emotions, and their executive command functions are coming from the neocortex rather than the lower systems being the limbic system or the R complex. So what happens in this episode is there's a manned space flight with 8 crew members that crash lands on what the astronauts believe to be an unknown asteroid. And they crash land in this barren desert area. And only 4 of the crew members survive. So we have the commanding officer, Donlin, and his name is derived from Gaelic, and it literally means world mighty or ruler of the world. And we can put this in context of the brain as the world, the ruler of the brain. He is the commanding officer, like I said. So he is the executive, higher level functions of the brain. And then we have the crewman, Pearsons, who represents the limbic system of the brain, which is the midbrain. He is the empathetic part of the brain. He is the emotional part of the brain. And then we have Corey, and Corey represents the R complex. Now there is a 4th character here, Hudak, but he is only here to drive the plot home about the resource issue that is taking place here. So Hudak is actually gravely injured and is potentially going to die, which he does end up dying. And this sets off Corey on his selfish line of thinking, pretty much. Not that he wouldn't have done this anyways, but it's good for the plot to drive it forward, because there's an external need to share resources with this being who is obviously dying. So this deals with the ethical issues and the moral issues when it comes to the utility of trying to survive being the consequences of this, right? So Donlin and Pearsons are taking care of Hudak, and they're sharing their water, the life force, right? The spiritual life force with Hudak, trying to keep him alive, or at least being humane with this individual and taking care of him till his last moments. Corey, however, has extreme resentment and spite against this, because it means it puts him at risk for the fact that he has less resources to use to survive. So he's in this fight and flight, and he's trying to accumulate as much resources as possible. We also see Corey try to steal Hudak's water at this stage, and we can also symbolically correlate the water to the need for higher level critical emotions and the moral compass. So he's seeking for that, but he's seeking through a proxy means, being a materialistic means to get this need for his personal survival, not realizing that by doing so, by living in this social Darwinian ideology of survival of the most ruthless, ends up being his downfall and has extreme detrimental returns for him. You know, he sees this as an irrational decision for all of them, though he's only truly thinking about himself. So Hudak does die, and then Donlin ends up sending Corey and Pearsons out into the barren desert to see if they can find resources to survive, or like any sign of civilization or anything like this. Eventually, Corey returns home, and he is claiming not to know where Pearsons is. Donlin realizes that Corey is guzzling down water out of his canteen, whereas before he only had a little bit of water, and he was being very careful with the water, which obviously implies that he had done something to Pearsons, which was factual. So Corey claims at this point that he found Pearsons dead and took his water. So Donlin, who is the higher level reasoning, the neocortex of this, so he wants to see for himself and forces Corey at gunpoint to lead him to Pearsons' body. They end up reaching the spot, and Pearsons is no longer there. And then Donlin confronts him and is like, hey, you know, did you leave him here? Is this the exact spot? Was he dead? Like, did you check on him? Did you do anything for him? And it's obvious that Corey is frantic about this because he thought he had killed Pearsons. And just to add a little bit more context here, the name Corey in Gaelic actually means in a cauldron or in a hollow, but it also in Latin means heart. So I think this actually means like hollow heart, like you have a hole in your heart, right? You have an emptiness in your heart. You lack empathy. And then Pearsons, his name comes from Greek, Pierce, and it means rock. And it was implied that Pearsons is killed by a rock because in the episode, Corey goes to grab a rock. He has this impulse to grab a rock and hit the members and take their water at one point. So they eventually find Pearsons. He's still alive, but he can't talk. And at this point, Donlin drops the gun and rushes to Pearson once they find him. So at this point, I think we can reveal and understand that, as I said, Donlin correlates to the higher level reasoning and thinking aspects of the neocortex. And then Corey represents the R complex, which is the oldest part of the brain, responsible for basic survival instincts such as aggression, dominance, and fight and flight response and motor controls. And in this episode, he quickly resorts to violence and deception, prioritizing his survival over the well-being of his comrades. And then Pearsons obviously represents the limbic system, which is associated with emotions, memories, and the formation of social bonds. So we see this memory aspect play out because he's the one who actually, in the episode, sees where they actually are at, which I will reveal in a moment. He exhibits empathy and a sense of moral duty. And we can look at this in a very interesting way because we can see that Pearsons has a high respect for Donlin. And this is the idea of thoughts and emotions being in harmony with each other. But the problem is that the actions are not in harmony with that. So the outcome, the output of this is not in harmony. So we have to have the trifold in balance to create, good outcomes. So the actions have to be in harmony with the way that we're thinking and the way that we're feeling. But this episode explains and shows the dangers of not having internal balance, right? So just think of all these characters as archetypes or symbolic representations of things that are going on within yourself, specifically your thoughts and your emotions and your actions that come from that, right? So when Donlin finds him, Corey gestures, because he cannot speak, he has lost his ability to speak, that he sees something and he's trying to relay this in a very basic symbolic form. So what he draws in the sand are actually telephone poles, which we find out later. So at the end, what happens is Corey ends up with the firearm and kills the higher level aspects of the self, the higher self, the neocortex. He kills not only the limbic system, he kills the emotions and the moral compass, but then he also kills the conscience, being the word conscience means coming together with knowledge. So that takes place in the higher levels of the neocortex. So he kills these two parts. And then he realizes that Pearsons was trying to tell them that they actually were on planet Earth the entire time. And that's what he was drawing in the sand, like I said, the telephone pole or the power poles. And then at the end, we see Corey's regret. He has this kind of psychosis, this mental breakdown that takes place where he's actually talking to nobody. He thinks he's talking to the other crewmen, but at some level he recognizes that, he had done a horrible, horrible deed far too late, or horrible deeds far too late. And then he weeps and begs for forgiveness for what he had done. So this interplay between Corey, Pearsons, and Donlin can be seen as this deep allegory for the constant struggle within the human brain between the primal instincts, the emotions, and rational thought, or the dangers of the internal contradictions that we all tend to express at some level. This episode is a warning for potential chaos when the R complex, being represented by Corey in this episode, dominates and is the executive commander, which leads to the violation of other people's liberties and livelihood, the absolute moral decay of the situation and the individuals. This also shows how natural law works, because this dominance of Corey's primal instincts leads to the ultimate breakdown of their social structure. And at the end, this tragic end, where it is revealed that they were on Earth all along, underscores the futility of Corey's actions and the catastrophic consequences of allowing the R complex to dictate and override reason and empathy. And one more little esoteric allegory that I found, which is that the name of the episode, Shot an Arrow into the Sky, serves as a hint into what will happen in the show or in the episode. In archery, they have a phrase, and it's called sin, which means to miss the mark. So this is a metaphor for missing the mark of truth and morality. So this alludes to the episode of missing the mark of truth and morality within the situation that they're in. So these three characters in the show represent three aspects of our consciousness and the dangers of the degradation and the breakdown of the unity of all these. And it emphasizes the necessity of balance among these three aspects and principles of the brain to navigate challenges and maintain humanity, and to live in harmony with natural law for the best outcome. Thank you very much for tuning in for this very short allegorical breakdown of this episode. Maybe I'll do some more of these in the future. You guys can let me know if you like this kind of stuff. Usually I go way more deep into this stuff, and there's so much more in this episode that we could cover. But I just thought I would give my thoughts on the triune aspect of the brain and how it correlates to these three main characters. See you next time.